The gunshot that shattered the morning silence sent every horse in Jack Morrison's corral into a panic. And when he finally calmed them down an hour later, he discovered that his entire eastern fence line lay destroyed, trampled by his own spooked animals who had broken through in their terror. Jack stood there in the dusty heat of that Wyoming morning in August of 1882, his hat pulled low against the sun, surveying the damage with a heavy heart. 20 posts snapped clean through, wire tangled like some monstrous spider web, and rails scattered across the prairie grass like broken matchsticks. He had spent 3 months building that fence when he first claimed this land 2 years ago, and now it lay in ruins. The gunshot had come from somewhere up in the hills, probably some drifter taking potshots at rabbits, but the damage was done. He was already behind on his work. The cattle needed moving to the northern pasture, the roof on his barn leaked like a sieve, and he had promised to help his neighbor, old Samuel Barrett, with the hay harvest next week. Now this. Jack rubbed his weathered face with calloused hands and tried to calculate how many days it would take to rebuild the fence. 4 days minimum, maybe 5 if he worked from sunrise to sunset. Days he did not have. With a heavy sigh, he turned back toward his small ranch house, a modest structure he had built himself from pine logs he had hauled down from the mountains. The place was nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was his. Every nail, every board, every stone in the chimney represented his sweat, and his dreams of building something permanent in this wild country. He was so lost in his thoughts about how to juggle all the work ahead that he almost missed the figure moving along his eastern property line. Jack stopped mid-stride, squinting against the bright morning light. Someone was out there, near his broken fence. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle he kept by the door, but something made him pause. The figure was not moving like someone trying to steal cattle or cause trouble. They were moving with purpose, bending down, standing up, working. Jack walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and as the distance closed, his confusion deepened. It was a woman, dressed in practical riding clothes, her dark hair tied back with a simple ribbon. She had positioned one of his fallen fence posts upright, and was tamping dirt around its base with determined strikes of a heavy mallet. Her horse, a sturdy paint mare, stood ground-tied nearby, saddlebags bulging with what looked like tools. "Ma'am," Jack called out, still 20 yards away, "what are you doing?" The woman looked up, and Jack felt something shift in his chest. She had a strong, honest face, sun-bronzed and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with powders or perfumes. Her eyes were the color of rich earth, and they met his with a directness that was rare in his experience. "Your fence is broken," she said simply, as if that explained everything, and went back to tamping the post. Jack walked closer, completely bewildered. "I can see that, but why are you fixing it?" "Because it needs fixing," she replied, testing the post with her weight. Satisfied, she moved to the next fallen section and began clearing away the debris. Jack stood there, hat in hand now, watching this strange woman work his land like she had every right to be there. "I appreciate the thought, ma'am, but this is my fence, my responsibility." She paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "I know it's your fence. I'm Margaret Chen. My father owns the property to the east. I heard the gunshot this morning and saw your horses scatter. Figured you would have your hands full calming them down, so I thought I would make a start on this." "Chen." Jack repeated, his mind racing. He knew the name. Samuel had mentioned that the old Peterson place had been bought by a railroad worker from California, who had brought his family out here to start fresh. Jack had never met them, too busy with his own work to socialize much. "My father came out here from San Francisco last spring," Margaret continued, lifting a heavy rail as if it weighed nothing. "He worked for the Central Pacific for 15 years before he saved enough to buy land of his own." Jack should have insisted that she stop, should have taken over the work himself, but something rooted him to the spot. He watched her work with an efficiency born of genuine skill, not just good intentions. She knew what she was doing. Every movement was precise, economical, effective. "Let me help at least," he finally said, shaking off his paralysis. Margaret looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, then nodded. "There's another mallet in my saddlebag." They worked in silence for a while, falling into an easy rhythm. Jack would position the posts while Margaret tamped them secure, then together they would lift the heavy rails into place. The sun climbed higher, turning the Wyoming prairie into a furnace, but neither of them slowed down. Jack found himself stealing glances at this unexpected woman, who had appeared on his land like some kind of frontier angel. "You know your way around a fence," he observed after they had reset the fifth post. "My father taught me," Margaret said, wiping her hands on her trousers. "When you are a Chinese family trying to make it in California, you learn to do everything yourself. Can't always count on neighbors being willing to help." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a statement of fact, and Jack felt a pang of shame. He knew how some folks were, knew the prejudice that ran through these territories like poison in a well. He had seen Chinese workers treated worse than animals when the railroads came through. Had heard men he once respected say things that made his stomach turn. "That's their loss," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "Anyone who would not help a neighbor based on where they come from is not worth knowing." Something softened in Margaret's expression, and for the first time since she had arrived, she smiled. It transformed her entire face, and Jack felt that strange sensation in his chest again, like his heart had forgotten its regular rhythm and was searching for a new one. They continued working as the morning stretched toward noon. Jack learned that Margaret was 23 years old, just 2 years younger than himself. She had helped her father lay track across Nevada and Utah before they had saved enough to leave the railroad behind. She could ride, rope, shoot, and apparently fix fences better than most men Jack knew. She spoke with an educated precision that suggested schooling, but her hands were as calloused and capable as any rancher's. "Why did you really come over here?" Jack asked as they worked on stringing new wire. Not many folks would go out of their way like this. Margaret was quiet for a moment, focused on twisting the wire tight. "My mother used to say that kindness is like water in the desert. You give it freely because you never know when you will be the one dying of thirst." She glanced at him. "Besides, good fences make good neighbors, or so I have heard. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Margaret said softly. "She died 3 years ago back in California. Fever took her in a week." "I'm sorry," Jack said and meant it. He knew about loss. His own parents had died during the war, leaving him an orphan at 14. The ranch he worked now, he had built from nothing, with no family to help or fall back on. They worked through the midday heat, and as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the fence began to take shape again. It was not pretty, not yet, but it was solid, functional. The post stood straight and true, the rails were secure, and the wire was strung tight enough to keep his horses where they belonged. As they hammered the final nail into place, Jack stood back and surveyed their work. What he had thought would take him 4 or 5 days alone, they had accomplished in one, working together. But it was more than that. Something had shifted inside him during those hours of shared labor. He had felt it happening gradually, like the slow breaking of dawn, but now in the fading afternoon light, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This woman, this strong, capable, unexpected woman who had appeared on his property and fixed his broken fence without being asked, without expecting anything in return, with nothing but kindness and good neighborly sense motivating her actions. She was everything he had not known he was looking for. In a land where most folks looked out only for themselves, where trust was a commodity rarer than gold. She had simply seen a problem and fixed it. Jack knew right then, with a certainty that defied all logic and reason, that Margaret Chen was the one. The thought should have terrified him. They had known each other for less than a day. He knew almost nothing about her beyond what she had told him while they worked. But standing there in the dusty Wyoming twilight, his hands sore from honest labor, watching her pack her tools back into her saddlebags with the same efficient grace she brought to everything, Jack felt more certain of this than he had ever felt about anything in his life. "Margaret," he said, and she turned to look at him. "Would you stay for supper? It's the least I can do after you spent your whole day helping me." She hesitated, and for a terrible moment, Jack thought she would refuse. Then that smile appeared again, soft and genuine. "I would like that. But I should ride home first and let my father know where I am. He will worry." "Of course," Jack said quickly. "I will ride with you if you like. I should introduce myself properly to your father anyway." They rode east together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Chen property was smaller than Jack's spread, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in industry. Even from a distance, Jack could see neat rows of vegetables, a well-maintained barn, and a house that, while modest, showed signs of careful attention and pride. Margaret's father, Thomas Chen, was a compact man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that assessed Jack with the same directness as his daughter's. He listened as Margaret explained how she had spent her day, and Jack watched the older man's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "You did not have to do that, daughter," Thomas said in accented but clear English. "I know," Margaret replied, "but it felt like the right thing to do." Thomas turned his attention to Jack. "You are the Morrison boy. Samuel Barrett speaks well of you, says you are honest and work hard." "I try to be, sir," Jack said, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "My daughter has a good heart, but she is also stubborn. Once she decides to help, there is no stopping her." "I noticed that, sir," Jack said, and was rewarded with a slight smile from Thomas. "You are welcome to bring her back for supper, but have her home before full dark. These are uncertain times, and I worry." Jack understood the unspoken concern. He had heard stories about Chinese families being harassed, their property destroyed, violence done for no reason other than ignorance and hate. "You have my word, sir. I will keep her safe." They rode back to Jack's ranch as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Jack's small house suddenly seemed shabby and rough when he thought about inviting Margaret inside. But she entered without hesitation, looking around with what seemed like genuine interest rather than judgment. "You built this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth pine logs. "Every bit of it," Jack confirmed, feeling an unexpected pride at her interest. "Took me the better part of a year, working in between everything else that needed doing." "It's solid work," Margaret said approvingly. "Good joinery, tight corners, you have real skill." Jack busied himself at the stove, grateful for something to do with his hands. He was suddenly aware of how small the space was, how her presence seemed to fill it with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire he was building. He put coffee on to boil and began assembling a simple meal from what he had on hand: bacon and beans, cornbread he had made that morning, canned peaches from the store in town. "Nothing fancy," he apologized as he set the food on the rough wooden table. "Fancy is overrated," Margaret said, sitting down across from him. "My mother used to say that the best meals are the ones shared with good company." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that felt natural rather than awkward. Jack found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around other people. There was something about Margaret that put him at ease, made him feel like he could be himself without pretense or performance. "Tell me about your ranch," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "What are your plans for it?" Jack set down his fork, considering the question. I want to build it into something sustainable. Not huge. I do not have ambitions to be some cattle baron, but large enough to support a family someday. Good stock, well-managed land, maybe expand into horses. The army always needs good mounts, and I have a talent for training them. A family, Margaret repeated softly. That's a good dream. What about you? Jack asked, emboldened by her openness. What do you want? Margaret looked down at her plate, and for a moment, Jack worried he had overstepped. Then she looked up, and her eyes held a vulnerability he had not seen before. I want to belong somewhere, she said quietly. My whole life I have been on the outside. In California, we were the Chinese railroad workers, tolerated because they needed us but never truly accepted. Here we are strangers in a strange land, trying to prove we have as much right to be here as anyone else. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I want to build something permanent, something that says we matter, that we are part of this place and it is part of us. I want neighbors who see us as people, not as curiosities or threats. I want a home, a real home, not just a place to sleep between work shifts. The longing in her voice struck Jack deeply. He understood it, perhaps better than she realized. He had spent his whole adult life trying to build exactly that, a place where he belonged, a home that was truly his. I think you will find that here, he said with quiet conviction. I know there are people who will make it hard, who will judge you for things that have nothing to do with who you are. But there are good people here too. People like Samuel Barrett, who judge a person by their character and their work, not by the color of their skin or where they came from. People like you, Margaret said, and it was not a question. I hope so, Jack replied, holding her gaze. I know we just met, but I feel like I have known you much longer. Is that strange? No, Margaret said softly. I feel it too. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and promise. Jack wanted to say more, wanted to tell her about the certainty that had struck him earlier, but he held back. It was too soon, too fast. She would think him mad. Instead, he said, I would like to see you again if you would be willing. Margaret's smile was like sunrise. I would like that very much. They talked late into the evening, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Jack learned that Margaret loved books, that she had taught herself to read from discarded newspapers and dime novels, building her own education from whatever scraps she could find. She learned that Jack had a weakness for terrible jokes and could play the harmonica passably well. They discovered they both loved the empty vastness of the Wyoming prairie, the way the wind moved through the grass like water, the enormous sky that made a person feel small and significant all at once. When Jack finally rode with Margaret back to her father's ranch, the moon was high and bright, turning the prairie silver. They rode slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. At the boundary of the Chen property, Jack dismounted and helped Margaret down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and she did not pull away. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. The fence, the company, for being the kind of person who sees something that needs doing and just does it. You are welcome, Margaret replied, equally quiet. Thank you for seeing me, Jack Morrison, not the railroad worker's daughter, not the Chinese girl, just me. That is all I see, Jack said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Just you, and you are remarkable. He rode home under the stars with his heart hammering in his chest, already counting the hours until he could see her again. The next morning, Jack was up before dawn, attacking his chores with an energy he had not felt in months. He moved the cattle to the northern pasture, patched the worst of the barn roof leaks, and still had time to ride into town for supplies before noon. He told himself he was not hoping to run into Margaret, but he knew he was lying. He did not see her in town, but Samuel Barrett found him at the general store and pulled him aside with a knowing grin. "Heard you had some help with your fence yesterday," the old rancher said, his eyes twinkling. "News travels fast," Jack replied, trying to sound casual. "In a territory this empty, any news travels fast," Samuel said. "The Chen girl, she is something special. Smart as a whip, works harder than 3 men, and has a good heart to boot." "She does," Jack agreed, unable to keep the warmth from his voice. Samuel's grin widened. "You have got it bad, boy. I can see it all over your face." Jack felt his ears burn, but he did not deny it. "Is that so obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes," Samuel chuckled. "But I am happy for you, Jack. You have been alone on that ranch too long, working yourself to the bone with no one to share the load or the rewards. A man needs a partner in this life, someone to build a future with." "I barely know her," Jack protested weakly. "Sometimes you just know," Samuel said with the wisdom of his 60-some years. "When I met my Martha, God rest her soul, I knew within an hour that she was the woman I would marry. 52 years we had together before the good Lord called her home, and I never regretted a single day." Jack thought about Margaret's directness, her strength, the way she had simply seen something that needed doing and had done it without expecting thanks or reward. He thought about the way they had worked together so naturally, as if they had been doing it for years instead of hours. He thought about the certainty that had struck him yesterday, that bone-deep knowledge that she was the one. "I think I do know," Jack admitted quietly. "I think I knew yesterday when I saw her fixing my fence. She did not have to do that, we were strangers, but she saw a need and she filled it, and something about that about her just felt right." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "Then do not let her get away, boy. Life is too short and this land is too hard to face alone when you could face it together." Jack carried those words with him as he rode back to his ranch. He was halfway home when he saw a rider approaching from the east. His heart leaped even before he was close enough to identify Margaret on her paint mare. She pulled up alongside him with a smile that made the bright afternoon seem dim by comparison. "I was hoping I would run into you," she said. "My father is going into town tomorrow to talk to the land office about water rights. I thought I might ride over and see if you needed help with anything." Jack laughed, feeling lighter than air. "You fixed my fence yesterday. What more could you possibly do?" "I noticed your barn roof was leaking," Margaret said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "I am fair hand with shingles." "Of course you are," Jack said, shaking his head in wonder. "Is there anything you cannot do?" "I am a terrible cook," Margaret admitted cheerfully. "I can make rice and not much else without burning it or turning it into something inedible." "Well, I can cook," Jack said, "so maybe we make a good team." The words hung in the air between them, meaning more than the surface suggested. Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his hand where it rested on his saddle horn. "Maybe we do," she agreed quietly. They rode together back to Jack's ranch, their horses walking side by side, their knees occasionally bumping in a way that sent sparks through Jack's entire body. He felt like a kid again, experiencing everything for the first time, seeing his familiar land through new eyes because she was seeing it with him. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a pattern. Margaret would ride over most days, and they would work together on whatever needed doing. She helped him repair the barn roof, and he helped her father build a new chicken coop. They rode out to check fence lines together, fixed a broken wheel on his wagon, cleared rocks from a field. Every task became an excuse to spend time together, and with each passing day, Jack fell deeper in love. They talked about everything and nothing. Margaret told him about growing up in railroad camps, about the casual cruelties and the small kindnesses that had shaped her childhood. She spoke of her mother's strength, how she had held their small family together through prejudice and hardship with grace and determination. She shared her dreams of maybe opening a school someday, teaching children who might otherwise have no access to education. Jack told her about his childhood in Missouri, about losing his parents and striking out on his own at an age when most boys were still figuring out which end of a hammer to hold. He spoke of the loneliness of those early years, the determination that had kept him going when everything seemed impossible. He shared his hope that his ranch could become something bigger than just his own survival, maybe a place where other young men starting out could learn and find their footing. They discovered shared passions, books they had both read, songs they both knew, a love for the wild beauty of the land they had chosen to call home. But they also learned their differences and found that those complemented rather than conflicted. Where Jack was sometimes impulsive, Margaret was thoughtful and deliberate. Where she could be overly cautious, he brought optimism and faith that things would work out. They balanced each other in ways Jack had not known he needed. It was in the small moments that Jack found himself most deeply affected. The way Margaret would push a stray lock of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The sound of her laughter, free and unguarded, when he told one of his terrible jokes. The way she would sometimes touch his arm when she wanted his attention, a casual gesture that felt like a benediction. The competence and grace with which she moved through the world, never asking for help but accepting it when offered, giving her own assistance freely and without judgment. One afternoon in early September, they were riding back from checking the northern fence line when they came across a small grove of cottonwoods clustered around a spring. The trees were just beginning to turn gold, and the sound of the water was soothing in the late summer heat. "Can we stop for a minute?" Margaret asked. "It is so beautiful here." They dismounted and let their horses drink while they sat in the dappled shade. The moment felt suspended in time, peaceful and perfect. Jack gathered his courage, knowing he could not wait any longer to speak what was in his heart. "Margaret," he began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain how to put his feelings into words. She turned to look at him, her expression open and patient. "What is it, Jack?" "I know we have not known each other very long," he said, the words coming faster now that he had started. "Just a few weeks, really. But I feel like I have known you my whole life, like I was waiting for you without realizing it." He took a deep breath. "That first day when you fixed my fence without being asked, I knew right then. I knew you were different, special, that you were the one I had been waiting for." Margaret's eyes glistened with sudden tears, but she was smiling. "Jack, I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength and your kindness. I love the way you see a problem and fix it. I love how you talk about your dreams like they are just on the horizon, waiting to be reached. I love that you are not afraid of hard work or hard truths. I love everything about you, and I know it is fast, I know it is probably crazy, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it now." "It is not crazy," Margaret said, reaching for his hand. "Or if it is, then I am crazy too, because I love you, Jack Morrison. I think I started loving you when I saw how gently you calmed your horses that first morning, how patient you were with them, even though you had every right to be frustrated. I saw the kind of man you were in that moment, and I have seen it confirmed every day since." Jack felt like his heart might burst from his chest. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "I know I should do this properly, should ask your father's permission first, should maybe court you for a proper amount of time, but I cannot wait. Marry me, Margaret. Be my partner, my wife, help me build this ranch into something we can be proud of. Let me help you build your school. Let us make a life together, a real home where we both belong." "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Jack pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, gentle and sweet, a promise of all the kisses to come. She melted against him, her arms coming around his neck, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed down to just the two of them, this moment, this perfect beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Margaret laughed. "My father is going to say we are rushing into this." Then we will convince him, Jack said confidently. Together, they rode to the Chen ranch holding hands, unable to stop touching, unable to stop smiling. Thomas Chen took one look at their faces and sighed deeply, but there was no real disapproval in his expression. "I see you have news for me," he said dryly. "Sir," Jack began formally, releasing Margaret's hand and stepping forward. "I would like to ask your permission to marry your daughter." Thomas studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "You have known each other less than a month." "I know, sir, and I know how that must sound, but I love your daughter with everything in me. I will work every day for the rest of my life to make her happy, to give her the home and the life she deserves. I will honor her, protect her, be a partner she can rely on in all things." "And what of the difficulties you will face?" Thomas asked quietly. "I do not need to tell you that not everyone will approve of this match. There are those who will judge her for marrying outside her people, and those who will judge you for choosing a Chinese wife. It will not be easy." "I know," Jack said steadily. "But nothing worth having ever is. I do not care what small-minded people think. I care about Margaret, about building a life together, about being the kind of man worthy of her love." Thomas turned to his daughter. "Is this what you want, Margaret, truly?" "More than anything," Margaret said firmly. "I love him, father. He sees me, all of me, and loves what he sees. With him, I feel like I have finally found where I belong." Thomas was quiet for another long moment, then he nodded slowly. "Your mother would have liked him," he said softly. "She always said you would know the right man when you met him, because he would treat you as an equal, not as something fragile to be protected or property to be owned." He extended his hand to Jack. "You have my blessing, Jack Morrison. Take care of my daughter." Jack shook his hand firmly. "You have my word, sir." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Samuel Barrett's ranch. Samuel stood up as Jack's witness, and Thomas gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes. The only other attendees were a handful of neighboring ranchers who had become friends. People who judged character over heritage and saw the love between Jack and Margaret for what it was, genuine and true, and worth celebrating. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Jack wore his best shirt and a new vest he had bought special for the occasion. The justice of the peace from town performed the ceremony, and when Jack kissed his bride, Samuel and the others cheered loud enough to startle the horses in the corral. The wedding supper was a potluck affair, everyone contributing what they could. There was roasted beef and fresh bread, vegetables from Margaret's garden, pies and cakes that the neighboring wives had baked. It was simple and heartfelt, and Margaret told Jack later that it was the most perfect day of her life. They spent their first night as husband and wife in Jack's small ranch house, which was now their ranch house. Jack had spent the previous week cleaning and making small improvements, adding curtains to the windows and a colorful quilt to the bed, small touches to make it feel more like a home and less like a place where a bachelor simply slept between work shifts. "It is not much," Jack said as he carried Margaret over the threshold, suddenly self-conscious about the rough simplicity of his home. "It is perfect," Margaret said, kissing him softly. "It is ours." They made love for the first time that night with a tenderness and passion that left them both shaken and amazed. Jack had been with women before, brief encounters that had satisfied physical needs but left him feeling empty afterward. This was different. This was Margaret, his wife, his partner, his love, and every touch felt sacred, every kiss a prayer of thanksgiving for the miracle of having found each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, talking in soft voices about their plans and dreams. "I want to add on to the house," Jack said, running his fingers through Margaret's loose hair. "Another room at least, maybe 2. We will need the space when children come." "Children," Margaret repeated, wonder in her voice. I have thought about it so much, about what kind of mother I might be, what kind of life we could give them. They will have the best mother, Jack said firmly. They will grow up knowing they are loved, knowing that hard work and kindness matter more than the color of their skin or what language their grandparents spoke. We will teach them to be strong and compassionate, to stand up for what is right, to see people for who they are inside rather than what they look like outside. They will have the best father too, Margaret said, kissing his shoulder. I see how gentle you are with your horses, how patient. You will be wonderful with children. They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Jack woke the next morning feeling more content than he had ever felt in his life. He watched Margaret sleep for a moment, marveling that this incredible woman was his wife, that this was his life now, before slipping out of bed to make coffee and start breakfast. He heard her moving around as the coffee boiled, and then she appeared in the doorway, wrapped in his shirt, her hair tumbling around her shoulders. She looked so beautiful in the morning light that Jack forgot what he was doing and nearly burned the bacon. "Good morning, husband," she said with a smile that made his heart race. "Good morning, wife," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have slept in years," Margaret said, resting her head against his chest. "I did not realize how much tension I was carrying until I let it go." They ate breakfast together, then tackled the day's chores as a team. Having Margaret there full-time changed the rhythm of ranch work entirely. Tasks that had seemed overwhelming when Jack faced them alone became manageable, even enjoyable with her help. They worked efficiently together, each anticipating what the other needed, moving in harmony like they had been doing this for years instead of days. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the prairie, talking about their day and making plans for the future. Jack had never been much of a talker before Margaret, but with her, the words flowed easily. She made him want to share everything, every thought and dream and foolish notion that crossed his mind. The first real test of their marriage came a few weeks after the wedding, when they rode into town for supplies. Jack felt Margaret tense beside him as they walked down the main street, felt her draw slightly closer to his side. He quickly understood why. The stares they received were not all friendly. Some people looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring. Others stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval to outright hostility. At the general store, the proprietor, a man named Henderson whom Jack had always considered friendly enough, was cold and curt. He filled their order but without the usual pleasantries or small talk. "That will be $12.30, Henderson said flatly, not meeting Margaret's eyes. Jack paid and gathered their supplies, his jaw tight. Outside, he helped Margaret load the packages onto their horses, aware of the whispers and stares following them. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I have dealt with worse," Margaret said, but he could hear the hurt beneath her brave words. "This is not right," Jack said, anger rising in his chest. "You deserve better than this." "We knew it would not be easy," Margaret reminded him. "You warned me yourself." "Knowing it and experiencing it are different things," Jack said grimly. "I am sorry, Margaret." "Do not be sorry," she said firmly, touching his arm. "We have each other. We have friends like Samuel and my father. We have a home and a future. What do I care if small-minded people disapprove? Their opinions mean nothing to me." Jack pulled her into a quick embrace, heedless of who might be watching. "You are stronger than I am." "No," Margaret said, "we are strong together." "That is what matters." They rode home in silence, but it was a companionable quiet rather than an uncomfortable one. Jack was struck again by Margaret's resilience, her refusal to let the prejudice of others diminish her sense of self-worth. She had dealt with this her entire life, he realized. The stares and whispers and casual cruelties that shocked and angered him were simply background noise to her, unpleasant but familiar. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Jack made a silent vow that he would work to make their corner of the world better, more welcoming, a place where their children would face less prejudice than their mother had endured. He did not know how exactly, but he would find a way. The seasons changed, and their life together found its rhythm. They expanded the house as planned, Jack and Thomas working together to add 2 new rooms and a proper kitchen. Margaret planted a larger garden, and together they built a greenhouse so she could start seedlings earlier in the spring. They bought more cattle, improved their breeding stock, and Jack's reputation as a horse trainer began to spread. The army sent a buyer out to look at his mounts, and was so impressed they placed a standing order for 10 horses a year. Margaret started teaching, not in a formal school but gathering a few of the neighboring children at their ranch once a week for lessons. At first, it was just the children of the few families who did not object to a Chinese teacher. But as word spread of her skill and patience, more parents asked if their children could attend. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, and she did it with such passion and dedication that even some of the more skeptical parents began to warm to her. Not everyone changed their minds. There were still those who made it clear they did not approve, who went out of their way to snub Jack and Margaret in town, or who muttered ugly words just loud enough to be heard. But gradually, grudgingly, through sheer force of character and consistent demonstration of their values, Jack and Margaret built respect in the community. Samuel Barrett became their staunchest ally, quick to defend them, and to remind anyone who would listen that the Morrisons were among the hardest-working, most honest people in the territory. Thomas Chen, now welcomed more openly at community gatherings thanks in part to his daughter's marriage, proved to be a skilled mediator and problem solver, earning goodwill that reflected positively on the entire family. In the spring of 1884, Margaret announced she was pregnant. Jack whooped with joy and spun her around until she was breathless and laughing, begging him to put her down. They shared the news with Thomas that evening, and the older man wept openly, saying how much he wished Margaret's mother could have lived to see this day. The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and Jack worried constantly, hovering over her until she finally told him firmly but kindly that she needed him to trust her to know her own body and limits. He tried to step back, tried to give her space, but it was hard when all he wanted to do was protect her from every possible discomfort or danger. "I am not made of glass," Margaret reminded him one afternoon when he tried to stop her from lifting a basket of laundry. "I am pregnant, not dying. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," Jack protested. "Not the most precious person in my world," Margaret's expression softened. "I love you for worrying. But I need you to trust that I will ask for help when I need it. Otherwise, you are going to drive us both mad." Jack reluctantly agreed, though he still found himself watching her constantly, looking for any sign of distress or discomfort. Margaret tolerated his anxious attention with patience and occasional amused exasperation, understanding that it came from love rather than a desire to control. As summer approached, Margaret bloomed. Her skin glowed, her eyes sparkled, and despite the physical discomfort of carrying a child in the Wyoming heat, she seemed happier than Jack had ever seen her. She talked to her growing belly constantly, telling their unborn child about the ranch, about the life they would have, about all the people who were already waiting to love them. In late October, on a crisp autumn morning when the cottonwoods blazed gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and dried grass, Margaret went into labor. Jack sent for the midwife from town, a gruff but capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher who had delivered half the babies in the territory. Then he sent word to Thomas, paced the floor until the older man arrived, and together they waited while female mysteries happened behind the closed bedroom door. The labor lasted through the day and into the evening. Jack had faced down charging bulls, broken wild horses, survived harsh winters and brutal summers, but nothing had ever terrified him like listening to Margaret's cries of pain and being unable to help her. Thomas sat with him, a steadying presence, occasionally sharing stories about Margaret's birth, about his wife's strength and courage. Finally, as full darkness fell and the stars appeared bright and cold overhead, Jack heard a new sound. A baby's cry, thin and outraged and absolutely perfect. He was on his feet instantly, and a moment later, Mrs. Fletcher appeared at the door with a small bundle wrapped in blankets. "You have a son," she announced with a tired smile. "And your wife is asking for you." Jack took the baby with trembling hands, staring down at the tiny red face, the wisps of dark hair, the miniature fingers that grasped at the air. His son. His and Margaret's. A wave of love so powerful it almost brought him to his knees swept through Jack. "Go to your wife," Thomas said gently, his own eyes wet with tears. "Let me hold my grandson." Jack carefully transferred the baby to his grandfather's arms and moved to the bedroom on shaky legs. Margaret lay in their bed, pale and exhausted but smiling. She had never looked more beautiful to him. "We have a son," she said softly as Jack sank down beside her, gathering her carefully into his arms. "You were so brave," Jack whispered, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "So strong, I am in awe of you." "He is perfect," Margaret said. "Did you see him? He is perfect." "Just like his mother," Jack said, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair. They named the baby James after Jack's father, with the middle name Thomas for Margaret's father. Little Jamie, as they quickly began calling him, was a good baby, healthy and alert, with his mother's dark eyes and what promised to be his father's stubborn chin. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Jack had never known it was possible to love something so small and helpless so completely. He would watch Margaret nursing their son, the two of them bathed in lamplight, and feel his heart swell with emotions he had no names for. This was his family. His wife, his son, his home. Everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, had led him to this moment. Margaret threw herself into motherhood with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything else. She read every book on child rearing she could find, consulted with experienced mothers, and developed her own philosophy that combined practical common sense with deep intuition about what Jamie needed. Jack supported her completely, taking on more of the ranch work so she could focus on their son, though Margaret insisted on maintaining her teaching once Jamie was old enough to be tended by others for a few hours a week. Thomas was a devoted grandfather, riding over nearly every day to visit with his grandson. Jack would often find the older man sitting on the porch with Jamie in his arms, speaking to the baby in Chinese, teaching him the language of his grandmother, keeping that connection alive. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Jamie grew into a bright, curious boy, full of questions about everything he saw. He followed his father around the ranch, learning to ride before he could barely walk, developing a natural affinity for horses that made Jack's chest swell with pride. But he also had his mother's quick mind and love of learning, spending hours looking at the books Margaret taught from, tracing the letters with his small fingers. When Jamie was 3, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, perhaps because she was too busy chasing after an active toddler to dwell on discomfort. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1888, a quick labor that had Jack barely getting Mrs. Fletcher there in time. They named her Sarah, and from the moment she entered the world, it was clear she had inherited her mother's determination. Sarah was louder than Jamie had been, more demanding, making her presence known in no uncertain terms. Margaret laughed and said their daughter knew her own mind, just like her grandmother had. With 2 children, the ranch house felt full in the best possible way. Jack built another addition, this time a spacious room that could serve as both a proper schoolroom for Margaret and a play area for the children when lessons were not in session. The small weekly classes Margaret had started years ago had grown into a proper school, with nearly 20 children attending regularly. The territorial government had even begun paying her a small salary, officially recognizing her as a teacher. Jack's horse training business continued to thrive. He was known now throughout the territory as a man who could turn even the wildest Mustang into a reliable mount. His methods were gentler than most, based on patience and understanding rather than brute force, and the results spoke for themselves. He took on an apprentice, a young man named David who reminded Jack of himself at that age, full of determination but lacking guidance. They prospered, not wealthy by any means, but comfortable. The ranch was paid off, they had money saved for emergencies, and their children never wanted for anything necessary. More importantly, they had built the home Margaret had dreamed of, a place where they belonged, where they were respected members of the community, where their children could grow up knowing they were valued and loved. Not everything was perfect. There were still incidents, still moments when the old prejudices reared their ugly heads. When Jamie started attending school in town in addition to his mother's lessons, he came home one day with a black eye and split lip. He had gotten into a fight with a boy who called his mother ugly names. Jack held his son while he cried angry tears and told him he was proud of him for standing up for his mother, but also tried to teach him that words from ignorant people had only the power you gave them. Sarah faced her own challenges as she grew. Some of the other little girls were not allowed to play with her, their parents citing various excuses that all boiled down to the same prejudice. It broke Jack's heart every time he saw his daughter's confusion and hurt, and it took all of Margaret's wisdom and patience to help Sarah understand that the problem lay with others, not with her. But there were victories too. When a new family moved to the territory from Texas, bringing with them their racist attitudes and causing trouble at community gatherings, it was Samuel Barrett and several other respected ranchers who stood up and made it clear that such behavior was not welcome. The family either needed to change their ways or move on. They moved on. When Margaret's school came under criticism from a few vocal residents who objected to their children being taught by a Chinese woman, the parents of her students rallied to her defense, writing letters to the territorial government praising her skill and dedication. The complaints went nowhere. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably, things were changing. Not fast enough, not completely, but changing nonetheless. Jack saw it in the way people greeted Margaret in town now, with respect rather than tolerance. He saw it in how their children's friends came to play at the ranch without hesitation, how other ranchers sought his advice and partnership, how Thomas Chen was elected to the local water board, the first Chinese man to hold any kind of official position in the territory. In 1892, when Jamie was 8 and Sarah was 4, Thomas Chen passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was well attended, a testament to the respect he had earned in the community. Margaret grieved deeply for her father, but she took comfort in knowing he had lived to see his grandchildren grow, had been part of the home and community he had worked so hard to build. Jack held his family close during that difficult time, grateful for every day they had together, knowing how fragile and precious life was. He made sure Jamie and Sarah understood what their grandfather had overcome, the strength and perseverance he had demonstrated, so they would carry his memory and his lessons forward. More years passed and the ranch continued to grow. David, Jack's apprentice, had become a full partner in the horse training business and had married a local girl. They built a small house on the edge of Jack's property, and David's wife helped Margaret with the school. Jack hired additional hands to help with the cattle operation, young men who respected Margaret and treated her with the same courtesy they showed Jack. Jamie grew into a capable young man, skilled with horses like his father but also drawn to his mother's world of books and learning. He talked about maybe becoming a veterinarian, combining his love of animals with formal education. Sarah was proving to be a gifted student and had announced at age 10 that she planned to be a teacher like her mother, but she wanted to teach in a big city where she could reach even more children. Jack and Margaret encouraged both their children's dreams while also teaching them the value of the life they had built in Wyoming. They wanted Jamie and Sarah to see the whole world if they wished, to pursue their passions wherever they led, but also to understand the importance of home, of community, of the hard-won progress their family had been part of. On a warm evening in June of 1896, Jack and Margaret sat on their porch watching the sunset, much as they had done countless times over the years. Jamie was in the barn tending to a mare about to foal, and Sarah was inside practicing her letters. The sounds of their children, the familiar landscape of their ranch, the solid house they had built together, all of it filled Jack with a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "Do you remember the day we met?" Jack asked, taking Margaret's hand in his. "Of course," Margaret said with a smile. "You looked so bewildered when you saw me fixing your fence." "I was bewildered," Jack admitted. "I could not understand why a stranger would do something like that without expecting anything in return." "I just saw something that needed fixing," Margaret said, the same words she had spoken all those years ago. "You fixed more than my fence that day," Jack said seriously, turning to face her. "You fixed something broken inside me that I had not even realized was damaged. The loneliness, the sense that I was just working toward some distant future that might never come. You made everything real, gave it all purpose and meaning." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "You did the same for me. You gave me a home, Jack Morrison. Not just this house or this ranch, but a real home, a place where I belong, where I am loved for exactly who I am." "I knew that day," Jack said softly. "I knew right then you were the one. It was the craziest thing, falling in love at first sight, but there it was. I watched you working on my fence, this strong, capable, kind woman who just saw a problem and fixed it, and I thought that is her. That is the woman I am going to marry. That is the woman I am going to build a life with." "And you were right," Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We built a good life, Jack, a really good life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple, the first stars appearing overhead. Their children's voices drifted from the house and barn, the sounds of family, of home, of the life they had created together. Jack thought about that long ago morning when a gunshot had scattered his horses and destroyed his fence, how he had stood in the dusty heat thinking about all the work ahead, feeling overwhelmed and alone. He thought about seeing Margaret for the first time, watching her work his land like she had every right to be there, fixing his problem without being asked, without expecting thanks or payment, just seeing a need and filling it. That simple act of kindness had changed everything. It had shown him who she was at her core, and in doing so, had opened his heart to the possibility of love, of partnership, of building something bigger and better than what he could create alone. She had fixed his broken fence, but more importantly, she had shown him what it meant to truly share a life with someone, to face hardships and celebrate triumphs together, to build not just a ranch but a home, not just a structure but a legacy. As the stars grew brighter overhead and Margaret's hand stayed warm in his, Jack knew with absolute certainty that everything he had ever wanted, everything he had ever needed, was right here beside him. That broken fence 14 years ago had been the best thing that ever happened to him because it had brought Margaret Chen into his life, and she had fixed so much more than fence posts and wire. She had fixed his future, his heart, his very soul. And that, Jack thought as he kissed his wife's forehead and listened to their children's laughter floating on the evening breeze was the greatest gift a man could ever receive. A love built on kindness and partnership, a family built on respect and devotion, a home built on the simple truth that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments, and that recognizing those moments when they arrive is what separates a life merely lived from a life truly cherished. They had built something beautiful together, something that would outlast them both, living on in their children and their children's children. The broken fence had been just the beginning. Everything that mattered had grown from that single morning when a stranger had seen a need and filled it, when kindness had sparked recognition. And recognition had bloomed into the kind of love that made every sunrise more beautiful, every challenge more bearable, and every moment more precious. This was home, this was love, and this was exactly where both of them were always meant to be.